local and state levels as well. As you already know, I think Mark also said it well, that change comes slowly at the federal level. Having worked at the state level, the Kansas legislature would have 90 days to receive legislation and act on legislation and either pass or let it go. So you have a very short period of time, and I think the closer the legislative body is to the constituent, the more responsive it can be. So one opportunity I did want to mention is a group called the Good Food Purchasing Program, which was established originally by the Los Angeles Food Policy Council, is now laying plans to go national. They are now also working in the Oakland School District in California to bring that certification program to the Oakland schools. They do want to go national, and I think that CLF has been part of a recent, very thorough review of their procurement standards on antibiotic use in food animal production, environmental damage, food waste, and animal welfare issues. So I think that group is poised to really expand aggressively nationally, and I think with the help of food policy councils across the country could do so. And I think it's an important opportunity to continue your work at the local level. I think there are a couple of cautionary notes at the state and local level. That there's an article just a few moments ago in the Hill publication, that's a publication that people on Capitol Hill and advocates read in DC, and the headline says, GOP aims to rein in liberal cities. And they particularly mention beverage taxes and minimum wage by cities that go beyond what the state or the federal level is willing to do. And I know a couple of state food policy councils have been dealing with the preemption question. I think that's something that you can see probably increase around the country. And we have, here at CLF, we're involved in several coalitions that sort of track these types of trends as kind of a loosely knit counterbalance to a group called ALEC, which is a conservative group that promotes conservative policy around the country. If it works in one state, like ag-gag laws work in one state, another state will say, well, what did you do to limit people's understanding or access to information about the food system? And they'll promote that legislation. It's a Koch brothers funded group. ALEC stands for the American Legislative Exchange Council. So I think we can help balance that to some degree with our coalition and networking work here. I would like to say one thing too about in the questions, and I know the other panelists will have a lot to say about these questions as well. A couple stood out at me about who might lead the USDA, EPA, CDC, and FDA and other food-oriented agencies. The Oklahoma Attorney General has been named, his name's Pruitt, he's been named to head the EPA. He's been more focused on clean water rules as it is impacted by the oil and gas industry. Although I think the House Freedom Caucus has put their bullseye a bit on the Clean Water Act and the Waters of the USA expansion of EPA authority. So he'll be a challenging director or administrator of EPA. The latest rumor about USDA is the former governor of Georgia. His name's Sonny Perdue. His background is he's a veterinarian by training and education. Very interested in the corporate ag structure that supports broiler production in the country. My personal bias about veterinarians, unless they're public health veterinarians, they've been kind of captive of the industrial ag industry for all their lives, and the pharmaceutical industry, because their professional association, the AVMA, is really funded by the pharmaceutical industry. And one last thing, I think there's at least he's new to me, food champion on the Senate side. He's become very vocal in the last 9 months. His name's Cory Booker from New Jersey, and he's very vocal on a whole range of food issues, access to healthy food in the inner cities, sustainable agriculture. He's been more vocal on animal agriculture issues, particularly focused on animal welfare issues, have been a real concern of his. Antibiotic use in animal agriculture has been of interest. There was actually a House race in New Jersey that flipped from Republican to Democrat, and one of the key things that we found out very close to the election in the last 2 weeks was that people would vote against a member of Congress who did not support restricting antibiotic use in food animals. And a group on the board of called Food Policy Action was able to flood that area with some mailings about the incumbent who had not done anything on that issue, and that was a small piece in getting it to flip. So I do think there are lots of opportunities, and I think I'm probably out of time.
Let's do it.
Yeah, and we'll relinquish my mic. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, and we want to turn it over now to Kate Fitzgerald. Take it away, Kate.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Kate Fitzgerald, and I've worked on food and ag issues for about 30 years, but have only been in DC for 8, so I don't have nearly the seniority that you're going to get from Bob and Ferd. And what I've been charged to do today is to talk a little bit about what we might be able to surmise will happen to programs in the nutrition title, and then various local food kinds of programs. And I think the first thing I'd say is I think we shouldn't panic. That while this has been an astonishing election and some of the nominees to various federal agencies have been surprising so far, there isn't yet a nominee for USDA. And I hope that means that there is serious discussion happening within the transition team, and they will end up with someone who has got real expertise in agriculture. But with that said, the Farm Bill will happen in Congress, and the membership of the House Agriculture Committee and the Senate Agriculture Committee is going to change very, very little. So given what they've done in the last Farm Bill and the kinds of hearings that have happened in the House in particular over the last 2 years, I think that there is a sort of blueprint that we can count on for approaches that we'll have to deal with going forward. The first thing that I would suggest is if you're interested in SNAP, the House Ag Committee during 2015 and 2016 had 16 full committee hearings and then several more hearings in the Nutrition Subcommittee. All of those videos are available online to watch at the House Agriculture Committee website, and they're really very instructive. As a result of those hearings, the committee then published on December 7th of 2016, so just a little bit less than a month ago, a report on SNAP. And that's also available on the website, and I think has been shared through this listserv. And I think that is a super important document also. And giving it, perusing it quickly, I think will make you feel a lot better. The key thing that is not in it, is never even mentioned, is the idea of block granting SNAP. And I was told by the committee chief of staff that they are not going to pursue that, point blank. Now, we will hope that that is true, but there are some other pieces in both that came up in the hearing and that are in the report that seem to indicate what committee leadership actually do want to do with SNAP. And they're all issues that you guys have dealt with in the past and on which local and state food policy councils can be helpful. The first one is categorical eligibility. I think that there will be discussion and some challenging on that. The report goes into that system in some detail, and it's worth looking at. The second thing that I am pretty sure that they will concentrate on is the issue of training and work. That work began in the last Farm Bill with pilot projects to 10 states to do training programs. There were several hearings that talked about training programs. And attached to that a little bit is the issue of the cliff, the challenge that families have when someone becomes employed or gets a raise and their income then puts them just above the level which qualifies them to receive SNAP. The members unilaterally agreed that that is not a good policy approach, that what they want is for people to continue to be able to move up and out of hunger and food insecurity, and getting a job should not then drop the bottom out of a family's food budget. So discussions of job availability, wages, and how the benefits can meet families' needs, but also help them transition to employment and start some savings will be themes going forward. The final piece is LIHEAP, the connection between heating and energy assistance and SNAP benefits. And for some reason, that seems to be an area in which they don't feel that the last Farm Bill tightened issues up enough. So, something to bear in mind when one hears some of the less friendly criticism of the SNAP program and the Farm Bill is that SNAP does absorb 80% of Farm Bill funding. And the amount that the SNAP program costs more than doubled in the last several years before the last Farm Bill. So for members who do not represent communities that have a lot of people that were impacted by the Great Recession, just looking at the numbers could be shocking. One of the things that the House Ag Committee report points out that I think is also important to bear in mind is SNAP, while the economy is improving and unemployment is down, poverty is not down by as much. So the Congressional Budget Office notes that indeed the SNAP caseload has gone down and the cost has gone down, but they do not anticipate that it's going to decrease by a whole lot more in the next 10 years, which is a pretty depressing prognosis for the state of the economy, but I think is something that we all need to keep in mind, because it will need to make talking points both emphasize that SNAP is important, the program works as it is meeting need, and the need is still there. And then also it helps buttress discussions about programs that not only meet food needs, but also nutrition needs and develop regional food systems that have job creation potential. The only other thing that I'd point out is, yes, the question of restrictions on SNAP or taxation on sugar-sweetened beverages are interesting in a different way. They can elicit both bipartisan support and bipartisan opposition. So there's no clear indication of how the committees might decide on either of those issues, but I think that both of them will come up as something, ideas that will want to be discussed. One of the other graphs that we see around a lot shows the incredibly steep increase in the cost of Medicaid, which will be an issue for states. And the argument can be made that by increasing the SNAP level or providing incentives or doing something to boost the efficacy of SNAP so that families can be not only fed but better fed, can be a way to reduce the costs in the Medicaid program. So those are the basic themes I see, and I think I'll pass it off to Ferd now to talk about the farm programs.
Thank you, Kate, and welcome, Ferd.
Thanks, Mark and Bob and Kate. Good to be with you all. And I think they've done a great job of laying stuff out. I'll just add a few things to the mix. So I think one important thing is the near term, the very near term. I think a lot of groups here are focused on defense, and eventually things will turn more to offense and being proactive. But right now, there's obviously a lot of concern about what's going to happen to anti-hunger programs, what nutrition standards, food safety, sustainability, local food, et cetera. So there'll be, I think a fair amount in the early weeks and months on defense. You obviously don't want your favored regulations or your favored budget line items to be the one in the meat grinder. So I think that will be a large focus. There are possibilities of Farm Bill action taking place early, prior to the actual Farm Bill. Those appear at the moment to be receding, but I think we'd be wise to be ready to respond in case those start taking off at any point. But right now, our working assumption, and it's just the working assumption, is that we'll be proceeding fairly normally, under fairly normal order for the next Farm Bill. So that being said, let me just take a brief moment, lay of the land. I think the other speakers have covered this a little bit, but no real changes at the top of the Agriculture Committee leaderships in either the House or Senate. Several new players at the bottom end coming in as new members and a few members leaving. That process is still in process, particularly on the House side. Senate side is pretty much done, but as soon as all of it is done, we will have lots of resources up on NSAC's webpage as to who the new players are in particular. And we've already done some outreach to some of the new Ag Committee members who have been announced so far. So stay tuned for that, because there are some changes, but not at the top. So the leadership is fairly clear. The bigger changes are on the Appropriations Committee, both the full committee and the Agriculture Subcommittee. And the biggest change of all will come once the House Ag Appropriations Committee gets named, which hasn't happened yet. So also stay tuned for that. Those are incredibly important. That's where all the funding decisions get made on all the discretionary programs for USDA and FDA. So enough on that. I was going to cover just a few things about Farm Bill specifically. Kate's already touched on a lot of the dynamics with the nutrition programs. I just want to point out really two things. One, almost all of the innovative programs about local regional food, about organic agriculture, about new and beginning farmers, veteran farmers, minority farmers, healthy food access, renewable energy, all of the what I call the more exciting, innovative programs in the Farm Bill that we've won through big campaigns over the course of the last 15 years, all will disappear at the end of the next Farm Bill process unless Congress decides to refund them. That is a very different situation than is the situation for SNAP and nutrition programs, for commodity crop insurance programs, and for conservation programs. All of those programs, even if there is no new Farm Bill, they will keep moving on with current funding levels more or less intact. But that is not true of the new farmer, minority farmer, organic, local regional food, healthy food access, renewable energy types of programs. Those have to be proactively refunded in the new Farm Bill. So that I would think would be of great interest to many of the people listening today, and will have to be a very well-run, well-coordinated coaching campaign to make sure that those don't get left on the cutting room floor during the next Farm Bill. And importantly, those will also disappear if the Farm Bill doesn't happen on time and doesn't be law in 2018. again, unless Congress takes specific steps to prevent that. So really, really important point. We can go into it more, but I just wanted to hit that big point. And then I'm not sure how much the farm programs is of interest to people on this call, but I'll just give you the super big picture snapshot for those who are interested. Obviously, the biggest thing is that commodity prices are low. They've been low for a little while. They're projected to stay low for quite some time. And that will be the predominant, on the farm side, not on the SNAP nutrition side, but on the farm side, that will be the predominant thing that gets talked about. The programs that were put in place in 2014 under much better price situation now are going to be seen as not sufficient to deal with the low price regime we're in now. So there are already major attempts to get major increases in funding for cotton and for dairy, and less major but not insignificant things going on all the other commodities as well. So I should think that that will be front and center. That is what, you know, the majority of people that get on the Agriculture Committee, that is why they get on and what they care about more than anything else. So it will take a lot of the airtime. And all the other issues need to fit in around that. But there are, of course, lots of other issues. There's a forestry title, there's a renewable energy title, there's a horticulture title, there's a rural development title, there's a credit title, and so on and so forth. So all of those things get attention. They get whole titles of the Farm Bill, but they get a whole lot less attention than the commodity programs and the crop insurance programs. Crop insurance, I think crop insurance got the major attention in the last Farm Bill, more so than the commodity title. It will probably continue to get lots of attention, but the commodity title will get even more attention than it did last time. I think that's a very safe bet. We will, at NSAC, will be running a campaign to do major crop insurance reform. That has the potential both to support conservation and family farms, but also provide for cost savings that could be used to help fund other programs. So be looking for that as a major thing. I will also just note that in the last Farm Bill in 2014, at the urging of the House Agriculture Committee majority, they've sunsetted almost every Farm Bill authorized program. And in the old days, some programs were sunsetted, but many were just permanent authorizations. That's no longer the case. So even on programs that don't get Farm Bill funding, but are authorized in the Farm Bill, it will be really, really important to make sure that those authorizations are renewed, because otherwise they sunset and those programs go out of business with the next Farm Bill if the new authorization doesn't pass. And I say that realizing that for decades and decades, Congress has funded programs that haven't been authorized. And that's sort of the normal way things work around here, but that is really changing quickly. And there's a major move on in the majority side of both House and Senate to insist on authorizations before any gets appropriated. So that's just another minor thing, more minor thing than the other two issues I hit, but we'll also bear very close watching as we move forward. And I'll just put in a plug that we will have a series of what we call marker bills this coming year, early in 2017, to help set the stage for what we want to see done in the Farm Bill. So there'll be one on beginning farmers, there'll be one on local regional food, there'll be one on conservation programs, one on crop insurance reform, and one on agricultural research. And we hope most of those get introduced both in the House and the Senate, and most hopefully will have her. So stay tuned for that. We haven't really taken that public yet because the bills are still very much in process, but within the next 3 months or so, you should start hearing about them. So that's just a little teaser promotion. So I'll stop there and see where the questions go.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ferd. Really appreciate that. Tremendous depth of knowledge among the three of you. I'm going to just start it off with, actually, first of all, remember, send in your questions via the chat box, or do it through email directly to Karen at kbanks10@jhu.edu. I'm going to just start off with one quick thing. Ferd mentioned this briefly, that about some of the programs that people have worked long and hard for, that the term you used was innovative, and that we're worried about what will become of them, and that they could all be lost at the end of this farm bill. I'm going to ask Kate. You've worked a lot with some of the programs like Community Food Project, Grant Program, FINI, and others. Any thoughts on that and how we might proceed, both to protect and maybe even enhance them as we go forward?
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I'd like to ask Ferd a question first. Ferd, because crop prices are so low, I have been hoping that means there will be pressure to move a farm bill in a timely way, which will help protect some of those programs. Do you think that's a reasonable expectation?
Yeah, it's very strange in a way, because every farm bill since the mid-1990s has been at least a 2, and then the last time around a 3-year effort on what every year before that only took 1 year. And so we've sort of gotten used to the idea that farm bills will take at least 2 years and not a single year. I would say, surprisingly, this is the first time that it looks like there's a reasonable chance to actually get it done on time, and driven exactly by what you say, the need for certain commodities to try to reform their underlying support program, and wanting to do that. I mean, they really want to do it in 2017,
Right.
So 2018 seems more realistic. That being said, if the farm bill gets divided and in the House, and SNAP is separated from the farm programs, and we go through something like what we saw the last go round, then I would say all bets are off. But there seems to be, at least, I would say there's not worse than a 50-50 chance that it stays together.
Right.
So, and if it does, and we're right about commodities wanting to fix their programs, I think that bodes well for actually getting it done, which would be great for the programs that otherwise expire, assuming we can win funding for them.
Right. Good. I mean, I think that's good news. And I'd go back to, so the kinds of programs that Mark is referring to are community food projects, farmers market promotion program, local food promotion program, beginning farmer and rancher development program, what is it called? Food insecurity nutrition incentive, FINI. What are some other ones that I'm forgetting? Healthy food financing, senior FMNP 2501. Are there other big ones that I'm forgetting, Ferd, or are those the major ones?
Yeah, I guess you said beginning farmer and rancher development program, and the organic research program.
Right, organic research. So all of those will disappear on September 30th, 2018, which is the end of the federal fiscal year. I think that the two things. First of all, I'd go back to a point that Bob Martin said at the very top of the call, which I think is crucial and cannot be emphasized enough, and that is just how enormously helpful it is and would be if all of you visited with your members of Congress. At this point, not necessarily with a particular ask, but just to let them know what you're doing. The more that they hear about the good work that the programs are doing in their communities, the higher it raises their visibility and makes it infinitely easier for the DC hacks like us to go in and talk to the staff, fill them in, and get a positive hearing. Democracy works in that way. Go meet your members, talk to them. It doesn't have to be a political visit. It can just be an educational visit. They should know how these federal dollars are being spent for good things in their communities. The second thing is so many of those programs not only meet immediate and very dire human needs, but also are stimulating economic activity. That's a real issue now. I mean, we saw in the last election, for the first time in a very, very long time, attention being given to rural America. And it wasn't positive attention in many ways, unfortunately, but I think that it does reflect the fact that things are really bad in many rural communities. Poverty is higher in rural areas than urban areas. And many of these programs are very effective at creating links between rural and urban areas, developing a little bit of economic development in rural communities that can grow, and demonstrating that to members of Congress, talking about the fact that food systems actually are coherent, rural is tied to urban, that the programs are not one or the other, will be very helpful, because it will also prevent a pitting of urban interests against rural interests, which none of us want when the Farm Bill decisions come to be made.
Thanks, Kate. I'm just going to add one quick thought to that. And for those people who are involved with food policy councils or food coalitions or any other group similar to that, I would suggest that you, as a group, begin to pay closer attention to federal policy if you're not already. One suggestion might be to create a special committee of your members who are going to focus on federal issues and pay attention to them. And then, following Kate's advice and Bob's advice, to meet with your members of Congress, but also to meet with your city council members, your county commissioners, and perhaps even your state legislative delegations. Let them know about how important federal food and ag policy is to your communities. And even to some extent, asking city councils and county commissions to take positions formally through resolutions that would support a particular action at a timely point. All these things kind of lay the groundwork for better action and a more sort of cohesive response from the local level. So don't wait until there's a crisis or an emergency, as Kate says. Meet with them now, lay the groundwork, and be ready to ask them, to your own local elected officials, to participate in the federal policy process. So we got a couple of questions, and I think the first one, yeah, somebody interrupt.
Yeah, this is Karen. Bob wants to chime in too.
Okay, sorry, Bob.
No, that's all right, Mark. Yeah, just to follow up on that. So I've worked in both DC offices and state offices at the federal level. And state office people really are thirsty for the type of work that you could bring to them, and that they love working on policy issues and talking about policy issues. And many times there's this bit of a split between DC and the state. And you'll make a lot of strides in advocating your policy positions if you get to know the state staff people very well. A lot of times it's impossible to get through at the federal level to the specific policy person, and it's easier to access or have access to the member when they're home in the state too. So I think the critical link is that that state staff person. Anytime that when I was at the federal level in DC and a policy issue would come up, I was fortunate enough that the members I worked for always wanted to know what the people at home were saying. And the first line of that is personalized mail from the state into the DC office. But a second one that was really effective is having advocates in the state offices of the senator or representative that you can influence. So connecting with the state staff is very, very important.
Good, excellent point. We have a question that I agree is very important, and the other, besides the Farm Bill, the other big food policy issue is child nutrition reauthorization. And I'm wondering, either Kate or Ferd, would you care to speculate on what's going to happen with regard to CNR? I'm going to pick on Ferd. I don't think we can hear Ferd, Karen.
Oh, there we go. Now can you hear?
Yes.
Okay, it wasn't clicking off for some reason. I can start and maybe Kate can fill in, but you know, it's been 2 years now of only getting a little ways through the process and not being able to finish. I don't feel like there's any big, especially with the Farm Bill coming up, that there's any major effort afoot to get it done. You know, funding wise, the programs will continue without the reauthorization. It could change. It could change once, you know, everybody has settled into their new committees and they put their agendas together. But right now, I would not expect to see it on the horizon in this Congress at all. I don't know, Kate, if you see it any differently.
No, I completely agree. And I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. The provisions of the Healthy, Hungry, Free Kids Act have been implemented very well by USDA. States are doing well with them. Having another several years to do even better is going to be, I think, helpful, and it prevents there to be an opportunity for any rolling back of those regulations. Senate Ag Committee has said they will not work on it, and since the House Ag Committee has a new chair, and she hasn't said that this is important to her, I think, Ferd, you're right. We're just going to continue with current legislation being extended.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add there, Mark, is that if the rollbacks, if there are rollbacks on the nutrition standard side, will come through the appropriations bill process. So there will be defensive efforts to fight on those.
And you know, on that point, this is another place where state and local food policy councils can be very helpful. There's no reason why schools can't do better than the regs. Like 99% of the schools are conforming with the regs. They would have to change policies and change practices now to actually do worse. And it's not immediately obvious to me why schools would do that, but something that local and state food groups can do is just encourage their schools to continue doing the good job that they are with the regulations that were in the last CNR.
Thank you. I've been prompted to remind everybody that CLF has created a federal action guide that was created a few years ago, and we'll post a link in the chat box for you eventually, but that is a good resource tool for everyone. I did want to pick up on, actually on something that urban agriculture has been a topic of significant interest from many people. It's been growing in popularity and as a great, particularly an exciting way to bring food topics and issues, and as well as just healthy food into urban communities. And there has been some action on the part of Congress to try to bring an urban ag bill forward. And I wondered if anyone would like to also comment on what the future of that might be. Is there an opportunity for any of us to influence that a new concept and whatever legislation might be put forward? Any suggestions from you, Kate?
Yes, there's definitely going to be urban agriculture legislation. Senator Stabenow introduced a bill in the last Congress, and Senator Stabenow is from Michigan, and Representative Marcy Kaptur, who represents Toledo and even up to a little bit of Cleveland, has also introduced a bill. It's an idea that is definitely hot. People are interested. USDA has been supporting it. I think there will definitely be discussion of it. One of the pushbacks is always, well, urban as opposed to rural. And I think that a point for those of us who believe that urban agriculture can be important and can help educate city people about food, where it comes from, and how hard it is to grow. Talk about it as a way to create, again, better linkages, better understanding with the other food production beyond urban areas where the majority of food is grown, and support for good farm policies like the kind that NSAC advocates for.
You want to add anything to that, Ferd?
Yeah, just in terms of Farm Bill architecture, there's always a miscellaneous title at the end of the Farm Bill. It tends to be where either random topics go or newer topics that don't really fit in a tried and true Farm Bill title that already exists. There's some talk that urban might be its own title, but I would tend to think it will be one of several topics that pieces of it wind up in the miscellaneous title. Another one like that is food waste. I would bet a lot of money that there'll be a food waste provision or two in the miscellaneous title of the Farm Bill, or at least in the Farm Bill someplace. There's not nearly as far along as the urban piece, but there's a tribal ag piece that is underway and being talked about. So there's a good chance that a variety of topics will emerge and go into that. The big interest of the chairs of the House and Senate Agriculture Committee and topics like that is trying to find ways to get votes on the floor, to get people excited about a bill that they might otherwise not pay a whole lot of attention to. So issues like that, urban ag or food waste, they see as potential vote getters. The one thing to note or to flag about that is, of course, there'll be great worry on the part of the anti-hunger and nutrition community, worried about getting too many moderate Republicans and liberal Democrats too excited about stuff that ends up in the miscellaneous title, if that would make them more prone to support some cuts to SNAP or other feeding programs. So that will bear close watching, but I think it is, going back to the positive side, it is a great opportunity to try to get some headway on some topics that haven't traditionally been part of the Farm Bill.
Thank you. And just to remind the audience that you can send your questions in on the chat box or by emailing Karen at kbanks10@jhu.edu. So keep those questions coming in. I'm gonna turn, actually one more, since we got you on the hook here for a second, Ferd. We probably should say something about FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act. Where do you see that in this current climate? What's the future look like there?
Yeah,
USDA has done a tremendous amount of work getting ready for it, I know. So there's a lot in motion.
Yeah, it's really hard to know. It is not an issue that President-elect has said very much about. They are still, I think, getting close to naming the commissioner for FDA. It's unclear whether the assistant commissioners at FDA, especially the one in charge of food, is staying or going. So more unknowns than knowns in the food safety arena. I think the biggest fear amongst food safety advocates right now is that FSMA has never really been fully funded, though it has gotten major funding increases, especially in otherwise very and appropriation bills that aren't growing. It's been surprising how well it's done, but there's real concern that that progress might be turned back and there won't be enough funding for FSMA implementation. So that's on the funding side. On the rural side, we think that there's an opportunity here with all the farm support that President-elect got during the campaign to try to fix some of the more problematic FSMA rules that would be very, very costly to small farms and local food farmers, and trying to get that worked out so that it's less draconian and less expensive for them to comply. So that will bear close watching, and USDA has a role too, especially on farmer training. That program has been funded each of the last few years, but is still pretty small. So I guess our biggest hope would be the farmer food safety training program would grow to a much larger size, and that there be some look at reforming some of the rules that are particularly costly to small farms.
Thank you. While we're in this arena of food safety, I'm going to turn to Bob for a moment and just ask you to give us some thoughts on where we're going on some of the other more public health related topics. We know antibiotics are in trouble, I believe. But what do you see anything else that we ought to be paying attention to with respect to promoting a healthy food system, a healthy food supply, making connections with between food production and our concerns about human health?
Well, yeah, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, antibiotics, as you said, is an obvious one. Things really aren't going to go anywhere with that at the federal level, and most states have shied away from doing antibiotics in food animals, except for California, because they always worry about federal preemption and have the FDA block as a problem. And by the way, just as a side note, the latest FDA statistics show that antibiotic use is still going up in food animal production. The voluntary guidelines have been fully implemented, and use is still going up. I think there's a couple of big water fights as it relates to animal agriculture anyway. I think that there's a bit of a concern that the House Freedom Caucus is interested in revisiting the Clean Water Act and to restrict, that's the traditional way that CAFO waste has been regulated, restricting its reach and effectiveness. Virtually all the Republican entities, I believe, have said they want to pull back the Waters of the U.S. rule, which from a public health standpoint would be a mistake. It may have, I think, through some of the misinterpretation of it by its opponents, been made to look like it was going to go too far, when in fact it was actually, from a public health standpoint, a pretty logical extension. So I think that there were some interest in applying the Clean Air Act to concentrated animal feeding operation regulations, and that likely will not occur now either. There is an interesting development on the West Coast, legal action brought by some environmental justice advocates that for the first time, it was last October, concentrated animal feeding operation waste was equated to the same level as industrial waste, which would allow different federal regulations to come into play, the Resource Recovery Act primarily. That was a bit of an important development that it moved it out from the more traditional interpretation that agricultural waste is benign because it comes from animals to actually equating it with toxic industrial waste. So there may be legal action that will further expand that into other areas of the country. As far as state and local action from a public health aspect, we look at the restrictions on access to agricultural operations, typically called ag-gag laws, as anti-public health because you're limiting the transparency of the industry. In a couple of states, those have been defeated recently, but I'm worried that there'll be a renewed effort to establish ag-gag laws in other states. Most recently was defeated by voters in Oklahoma last fall, really, and it was an interesting argument. It was family farmers said oppose ag-gag because it benefits the large industrial farms. So that was kind of a different political dynamic as opposed to other states. So I think those are probably the main areas to look out for.
Well, on this topic, one of the questions that came from our registrants in advance was, does the political dynamic now set up a new sort of potential conflict between the federal government and state governments? You mentioned earlier what might happen, the preemptions around sugar tax and so forth. Will there be any other ways that we could see, this sort of let's now turn to the cities and the states as a way to, challenge what a new federal regime might bring forward. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think there could be. I think there's all sorts of concerns that have been expressed about states that, again, in animal agriculture production that have set different regulations for animal welfare standards. California is really well known for its ban on battery cages, and not only they went a step further and said eggs that are sold in California have to meet the California production standards. It's similar to what's been done at different times on auto emissions. California legal. Massachusetts just passed a ban on battery cages and gestation crates. So there could be a threat to those state initiatives from an interstate commerce perspective, that there'd be federal preemption. I've not heard that, but I think they're too distracted right now on other issues. But I think that's a possibility.
Mm-hmm. I'll throw in that I think there's an opportunity for states to not take sort of positive action in the sense of funding programs that may be threatened or underfunded by federal changes. In my state of New Mexico, there's been good work done in securing state funds for double up buck programs for the farmers markets and for farm to school programs as well. So, encouraging where you think there might be any political opportunity at all, consider meeting with your state representatives and putting forward some new ideas, perhaps for modest expenditures that might begin to fill in the gaps or even create new opportunities along the way.
I would agree with that, Mark.
Yeah.
Adding to that, healthy food financing, which started as a state idea and then became national, but there are now many states that have their own good food financing programs. So yeah, I think a lot of good things, ideas can be tested and shown to work at a state level and then percolate up and form policy here.
Good. Okay. Now there was one question we have I want to make sure that we get to, and comes from a big city on the East Coast that will otherwise remain nameless. Do you have any advice for food policy councils that are housed within city government and are not mandated to advocate? Is there anything we should be asking our mayoral administration to do as a city? My 2 cents on that is that just because you are housed within city government and maybe don't have a specific mandate to do advocacy, I think you are well within your rights to be able to educate your policymakers about what is going on and what the again the threats and opportunities might be with respect to federal policy. This I know Baltimore has done a fair amount of this over the years with their food policy council and their food policy staff that is housed within city government. So I'm not aware that there would be restrictions per se, and I think that it would be very wise, very prudent to be able to engage with your city elected officials and keep them well informed about what's going on in Washington, and give them and suggest to them opportunities when they might be able to take some action.
I would chime in quickly about an example that we had here at the Center for Livable Future, working with Holly Friestad and the mayor's office in Baltimore. And just by happenstance, I was talking to Holly when she was in visiting with Ann about a federal policy issue that she could help on and engage in. And it was during the time of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans development. And the advisory committee had put out recommendations on dietary guidelines that we particularly supported on sustainability considerations when looking at dietary choices, meaning, if you have a lower meat diet, it's better for the environment and more sustainable, and the specific recommendations to lower meat consumption. And there was a real fight between Vilsack at USDA not wanting those in because he was very interested in protecting the meat industry and saying sustainability discussions were not appropriate for the dietary guidelines for Americans recommendations, and advocates and the advisory committee itself feeling very strong about it. So I suggested to Holly that the mayor then, Baltimore mayor then, was very active on food policy issues in the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And Sheila Pratt Dixon, I think, was, no,
Stephanie Rawlings Blake.
Stephanie Rawlings Blake was the mayor at that time. I don't live in Baltimore, so I apologize for that. She took a resolution to the U.S. Conference of Mayors supporting the dietary guidelines as proposed by the Scientific Advisory Committee. It was then adopted by the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and we were able to use that to not a successful outcome, but use that general statement of the U.S. Conference of Mayors to push a federal policy point that really had origins at the city level.
And adding to that, the basic point is, yes, you can also do work through organizations of which you're members. Public health departments belong to national organizations of public health departments. Planning agencies belong to the American Planning Association. There's the mayor's group, there's government group, governors groups, and all of them can advocate here in DC. So sharing what you're doing directly with the members of Congress as public education, but also with the associations to which you belong is helpful.
Okay, well, thank you both. And again, reminding folks on the call that we'd love to hear your questions and your comments. Please feel free to chime in and through the chat box or by email directly to Karen. We did have, Kate, you commented briefly on the Healthy Food Financing Initiative. And we just want to, are there anything else that you think we ought to be, know about it? One question is that there's curiosity about what you overall think about the program and what, what some of the opportunities might be perhaps to expand it. Anything else you could add on the Healthy Food Financing Initiative?
I am definitely not an expert on that. The three organizations that take a lead on it are the Food Trust in Philadelphia, the Reinvestment Fund also in Philly, and Policy Link in Oakland. And they have information on their Healthy Food Access portal. It's been hard because the way the funding flows now, it comes through the Department of Treasury, the Department of Health and Human Services, and USDA's little piece of it has only been funded for a very small amount, I think $1 million. I think the concept is fabulous. I think it's done, the Pennsylvania version, which is the one I've seen working. I've seen it develop new stores. I've seen it improve farmers markets. It can be really, really excellent. I know that there's going to be work on changing it, tweaking it slightly in this new farm bill. One of the things that I do think about is whether there are ways to more formally or closely tie it with programs like FEME, the SNAP Incentive Program, SNAP Ed, sort of integrate these programs, all of which are geared towards many of the same people. And if we could find a way for them to mesh more easily, I think we might increase the efficacy of all of them.
Okay, well, thank you. So I think, Karen, we're going until, what, is it quarter past or half past the hour?
We have until half past the hour.
So, any other comments? But one thing we really are interested in knowing is, where do you currently get information now about federal policies? What are your sources? It'd be helpful for us to know. If you want to just shoot us a few things right away, give us a list, that would be great. So I got one question here is, can you comment on the opportunity for food policy councils to create and be part of effective advocacy coalitions? This is an important piece in this environment. Well, if I understand the question correctly, I think that you as a Food Policy Council are and can be, if you're not already, an effective advocacy organization. You may want to shop around and look and perhaps partner with other organizations in your region or state that are perhaps more focused on advocacy, and see if there's an opportunity to work with them. Perhaps you can become the food piece of their broader policy agenda. Keep that in mind. But I think, as I recommended earlier, if you can have a committee or have perhaps someone appointed as a liaison to learn more about what's going on at the federal level. There's plenty of opportunities to educate yourselves. There's plenty of material out there, plenty of sources, and I would encourage you to get in touch with those and to sort of just build up your own advocacy muscles over time.
I would say that I think food policy councils can be enormously effective advocates. You guys include, first of all, representatives from various sectors in the communities that you serve, which gives you an advantage already. You're not just public health, you may also be a farm group. The fact that you represent the multiple different interests and have come together and if you can support particular policies, I think can be very, very persuasive to members of Congress, because it indicates to them that there is cross-sectoral, broad-based support for particular ideas. I think you guys have a lot of potential credibility and ought to use it.
Some people have mentioned that, surprise, surprise, they are getting their policy information from Kate Fitzgerald, NSAC, and also FRAC, the Food Research Action Center, as well as our own Food Policy Council listserv. So those are some good sources, as we already know. If anybody has any other suggestions on sources for information about federal policy, please shoot them into us. Karen has been moving this list of questions around so rapidly, I haven't been able to, as soon as I get halfway through, they move, so I have to be able to read them. Oh, I know. This is an interesting question. One that might be a little scary, but it's sort of worth thinking about. Is what are the prospects for a where did it go? Just moved. What are the prospects for a U.S. food policy over the next few years, 4 years? I mean, we have a farm bill. There's been many people that have advocated for something that looks like a broad national food policy as opposed to just a farm policy or farm bill. Any thoughts on where something like that, if that has any legs or any hope? Ferd, I'll let you be the spokesperson.
Yeah, I would venture to say it might not be the right moment of opportunity for that. Which is not to say it's not a noble effort, but it's probably not the greatest timing-wise for it. There is a lot of attention to it, increasingly so. There's now a published paper that does a cross-country analysis of different kinds of ways of different countries addressing national food policies. There's a new book that just came out by Steve Clapp on national food policy or national food system that goes into a lot more detail than some of the previous, much shorter essays on the topic. So it seems like it's a issue that's getting more rigorous treatment, and I think could probably go through a several-year gestation period before it's probably ready for prime time. But certainly worth continuing to pursue. But I don't think the next 2 years is anything like the right time to bring it up, especially with Farm Bill going on. That being said, there are aspects within the Farm Bill where we're getting really good attention, in smaller chunks about setting goals and objectives and having metrics and evaluation, conservation title being a prime case in point. That's something that's always been lacking. We've actually pushed it for multiple farm bills, and it's one of the ideas that we push, and then it gets no traction and we move on. But this time it feels like we're getting more traction, and it's bipartisan traction. So maybe in smaller chunks, like nutrition title goals, conservation title goals, rather than looking at everything. So that would just that's even segmenting just within the Farm Bill, much less all of national food policy. But again, I would encourage people to continue to think about it and talk about it, but probably not try to move forward on it right now.
Bob or Kate, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think that while we call it the Farm Bill, I mean, as we've said, the vast majority of the funding actually goes to the SNAP program. And I think there's already nascent pieces of food policy embedded in the Farm Bill that can be nurtured and built. And the more we talk about it as a coherent piece of legislation that makes sense to various kinds of farm production, but also to healthy food access, sufficient food access, the more we help move psychologically the conversation forward. So yeah, I agree with Ferd that this is not a time when people can feel comfortable just throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but I absolutely think that we can use the structure of the Farm Bill as we have it to move good food policy forward.
Mm-hmm. Bob, you want to add a thought?
I'm in quickly that I would agree with both Ferd and Kate, primarily that it's probably not the best time to try to bring it forward. I think the United States obviously needs a national food policy. I think unfortunately it's been cast in some circles as an elitist approach to food production or food policy. I don't think that's fair, but since we have a president-elect who is a member of the elites but says he's not an elite, it's probably not right timing, but I do think we should keep talking about it and being ready when the time's more appropriate.
Okay, thanks. We have some other thoughts on sources of federal policy information. Feeding America's national office in DC is highlighted as a great resource for advocacy. We also have suggestions of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. The listserv, ComFood, of course, is a good source. State and state departments of economic security. I guess maybe that's in particular states. State-level advocacy-focused nonprofits with links to national parent organizations. Maryland Hunger Solutions is a good example, with its link to FRAC. So there are other sources. Union of Concerned Scientists as well. It's putting out a lot of information. Has been a great source. I think we're probably getting near the end here. I'm not sure. I'm going to ask perhaps if Kate, Ferd, and Bob, you might have any last thoughts. And if we get any more questions in after that, that would be fine. We'll take them. But I'm wondering if you want to maybe have a concluding minute or so, Kate, Ferd, and Bob. Kate?
Thanks. I would just really like to thank, it looks like we've got 89 people still on. Thank everybody who's participated and encourage you absolutely to be engaged. I think that the potential power to help do good food and farm policy through food policy councils is enormous. And I think all of us would like to help you in any way we can.
Ferd?
Yeah, I just reiterate one thing and add a new thought, reiterating that, we're going to need all hands on deck to save the programs for new and young and beginning farmers and minority farmers and organic ag and healthy food access and renewable energy and all the rest that, are really up for grabs. I can't stress that enough. We could keep them and grow them in the next Farm Bill, or they could all disappear. And from a federal policy standpoint, the food policy world would look a whole lot different without all those programs in place. So really need all hands on deck, really encourage people to be engaged maximum extent possible, especially on that issue, but on all the issues. And then the new thought is just a reminder at the state and local level that there's the 3 frontline USDA agencies that operate at the state and local level: Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Farm Service Agency, and the Rural Development Agencies. And so you can, as I'm sure many of you know, and probably most of you do, you can interact with them at the county level, at the state level, and it is where a lot of actual on-the-ground policy, the nitty-gritty policy decisions get made, because there's always a lot of flexibility that's handed down to the state level to decide how to implement Farm Bill or other programs at that level. So I would really strongly encourage engagement there for both Farm Service Agency and Rural Development. Those are also political appointees. So there'll be new Republican appointees in the next 4 or 5 months for those agencies. Those will be, people, if you don't know them, you'll want to know them. They could help or harm, so good to get a relationship. And on the conservation side, even though that's not a political appointee position, it is an important place, and perhaps more so than the other 2, is a place where you can engage, because there's the State Technical Committee, which basically you become a member of by showing up, and you get to help decide how conservation programs from the Farm Bill get implemented in your particular state. So it is a place where you can gain a voice and gain traction if you can become part of that State Technical Committee network. And also realize that times are changing. Farm Service Agency traditionally people think of just as commodity programs or the credit programs, but for instance, in the waning days of the Obama administration, they have just made the Organic Certification Cost Share Program part of FSA now. So that implementation will happen through FSA going forward. So if you're involved in organic farming at all and need cost share assistance, FSA is the new place to go for that. So there's just a lot that can be done at that level. USDA is much more so than many federal agencies is an on-the-ground agency still. It's shrunk to some extent over the past few years at that level, but it still exists on the ground, and it's a place where you can really reach out and interact. And remember that those state directors and state conservationists also impact federal policy. So you can advocate to them, they can in turn advocate back to headquarters. So that's just another way of making your voice heard.
Good thoughts. Bob, any concluding remarks?
Yeah, I would just like to thank everyone also for participating today. And again, it was an honor to be included. I think I would just end with one kind of general thought. I worked on the Pew Commission on Industrial Farm Animal Production, and the chairman of that commission was a former governor of Kansas named John Carlin. He was a dairyman by education, but was in the state legislature in Kansas for years and ended up serving 2 terms as governor. He had a saying that was, politicians at all levels see the light when they begin to feel the heat. So my is bring the heat.
Okay, good thought. We did get one last question. I'll try to address it. Is there a National Food Policy Council that might be meeting regularly that can move the conversation forward? Well, the answer is no, there is not a National Food Policy Council. However, I will say on behalf of Center for a Livable Future that we have had some discussions about what we can do with our networks of food policy councils to have some kind of discussion, education, influence on federal policy. So I think that conversation will be moving forward in the months to come. So not seeing anything else here, I'm just going to conclude by saying that when we were shopping around for a title for this webinar, in my less lucid moments, I had this thought that, well, maybe we call this, is there life after the election? Talking us down from Suicide Bridge. Hopefully we've done a little bit of that for you today. Hopefully you feel a little bit less gloom and despair, some hope. Yes, there are threats, but there are indeed opportunities. So hopefully you can find ways locally and at the state level and otherwise to get yourselves organized if you're not already, and begin to bring some pressure to bear on a new administration, which perhaps will be not as dire as we have imagined. So let's hope, let's work together, let's stick together and stay strong. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen and see if you have any other instructions or thoughts for us.
Just thank you, Mark, for moderating and facilitating this conversation. Thank you, Kate, Ferd, and Bob for participating. We got some really great responses from people saying it was a super call, and they're really appreciative for you guys for taking your time this afternoon to talk with us. So with that, thank you, and we're adjourned. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.